The Clock Tower series has seen many ups and downs. The first game struck fear into the hearts of Japanese point-and-click fans back in '95, and since then, it's sprawled into a full-fledged series, with its sequels pouring into the Western world. While Clock Tower 2 was a pretty good sequel, Clock Tower Ghosthead, it was an abysmal mess. I'd easily consider it the second worst game I've ever beaten. Perhaps it was the fault of the original game's director being absent for that one. Sometimes things change. Properties are handed to different people, and those people do different things with them. And that's precisely what happened in the case of Clock Tower 3. After Human Entertainment went defunct a couple of years after Ghosthead's release, the property landed in the hands of Sunsoft, who you might know for classics like Batman on NES and Blaster Master. It was later announced these guys would be developing Clock Tower 3 alongside Capcom. That and the cutscenes would be directed by Kinji Fukasaku, who was a pretty big film director at the time. I admit I don't really know that much about this guy. As far as Japanese directors go, I only really know the obvious Kurosawa and Miyazaki, but apparently he was a pretty big deal. You guys might know him for Battle Royale, but he also made a lot of award-winning Yakuza and samurai films. And they certainly boast it like it's a huge deal. His name is one of the very first things you see when the game boots up. Fukasaku, Sunsoft, and Capcom would bring Clock Tower 3 in a much different kind of direction, and of course a lot of that just has to do with the times. Like, you don't want your game using outdated game mechanics on the PS2, you gotta have it fresh and up to current standards, but even still, it ended up being a really different kind of game rather than a fresh and modernized version of the Clock Tower series, and, well, whether that's for better or for worse, why don't we play it and find out. The CG is definitely a huge step up. I mean, I know it comes with a generation of hardware, of course, but man, only seconds in and you can already smell that Capcom budget. So we watch this creepy old dude walking towards Luigi's mansion, and, oh. I have no idea what just happened. Oh, nice, finally, another title screen that actually has a clock tower on it. Come to think of it, there wasn't a single clock tower in Ghosthead, but I mean, that was a side game, so whatever. The plot begins with a boarding school student named Alyssa Hamilton who gets a bizarre letter from her mother. Hold on, Alyssa? The previous game's protagonist was named Alyssa. That's so weird that they would reuse the same name so quickly. Like, this is not the same character, this is a completely new one. They just called her the same thing. Well, to be fair, I guess her name was Yu in the Japanese version. It was the localization team that decided on the new names. Kind of funny how that game clearly took place in Japan, yet they gave everybody American names in the English version. The names in the first two games made sense because of the Norwegian setting, but yeah, not so much in Ghosthead. Anyway, the letter explains that Alyssa was sent away to boarding school for 6 years for her own protection. Her mother warns that with Alyssa's 15th birthday coming up, she's in danger and needs to go into hiding until the day passes. Alyssa's then told she got a phone call from her mother, but when she answers the phone, nobody's there. Concerned for her mother, Alyssa rushes home to make sure she's safe, but instead she encounters a strange cloaked man who gives her the creepy old dude sit rep.
She mentioned that she would not be coming back for some time.
What?
She was wrong. She won't be coming back at all.
Ooh, that voice acting. I liked Ghosthead's voice acting quite a bit, but Clock Tower 3 easily brings the performance quality into something you'd expect from a AAA studio like Capcom. The production value here is very apparent. The textures could look a little bit better, but the models look great, and the animation is great too. The game's only from 2002, so seeing mocap like this early on is pretty cool. Though the acting is just so ridiculous sometimes. Like, everybody acts like they're on an episode of Looney Tunes, especially the villains. And like, I know that very theatrical acting was commonplace in Japanese PS2 games, Metal Gear Solid being a pretty good example. The physical mannerisms of the villains was often cartoonish and extravagant, like they're in a play or something. But this is just a lot to handle, and knowing that they had real actors being this ridiculous on set, man, these guys must have really poured a lot of energy into their performances. You can even tell that sometimes the motion capture actors were on wires when they jumped around, which is really interesting because this is a 3D animation. They could have got rid of that if they wanted to, so it seems to me that these kinds of movements were intentionally preserved, maybe in order to capture the weight and physics involved in the production of something real with real actors. I imagine this was a decision by Fukasaku, and it does make the game feel very theatrical, like a stage play, and I'm sure that does have artistic value, but but the English voices just don't really match it that well all the time. It's pretty easy to tell that the voice actors didn't get to see the animations while they recorded their dialogue, so there's a little bit of a disconnect there sometimes.
Phew, I thought I was a goner for sure. Long time no see, Alyssa.
It is super entertaining though, but kind of at the expense of not really being able to take the villains that seriously. I found it impossible to be scared of these guys with how cartoonishly they were acting. I guess I had the same problem with Clock Tower 2 Scissorman, the goofy animations made them not that intimidating to me. Not to say these villains aren't intimidating, I mean, like, look at them, they look like they could take down a freaking army, but I just had a hard time being scared because of how wacky their movement was. The chase music doesn't really help either. It sounds so bumbling and goofy. Now, you might have noticed that there's been no cursor on screen this time, and that is because, unlike the prior 3 games, Clock Tower 3 is not a traditional point-and-click. Instead, you'll move the character by more traditional means via the analog stick. Similar to Resident Evil or Silent Hill, Clock Tower 3 uses fixed camera angles, and they are used pretty damn effectively. It gives the game a more cinematic look, but more importantly, it creates moments where the pursuer can seamlessly pop in between camera cuts, and that honestly caught me off guard. However, with the fixed camera angles comes the same problem I find a lot of these games have. You control Alyssa with typical analog control instead of tank control, so that means if you're pushing a direction and the angle changes, well, the direction you're holding is no longer the direction you want her to go in. And like most other games with this problem, it mitigates it by having the character continue running in that direction despite what direction you're holding when the angle changes until you move the stick somewhere else, and that gives you a chance to snap the stick to the new direction proper, so you won't find yourself wobbling back and forth as the camera flickers like Rule of Rose did. That game did not fix that problem at all. But even still, it's weird and jittery, and I've never really liked it. Silent Hill 2 and 3 do the exact same thing, but those games also have the option for tank controls if you're one of those nut jobs like me that actually prefers it. And honestly, I know everyone disagrees with me, but I would just rather tank controls, man. So long as there's strafe buttons and a quick turnaround button, I'm fine with them. But I know the majority of people will probably prefer this compromise instead, and if they had to go with one or the other, going with this one definitely made the game more accessible, so I agree that was the better decision. But even still, the option would have been nice. The core mechanic of being pursued and having to find a weapon or a hiding spot is still one of the primary things you'll find yourself doing here, but this time, since you kinda don't have a cursor to hover over everything to find out what you can and cannot click on, the interactable environment pieces will now be marked with a glowing orb. I kinda don't really like this. I think it makes it a little bit too apparent where you should flock to. It becomes less a panicked effort to find a hiding spot and more a quick trot to the nearest glowing thing. The pursuers are a lot more aggressive this time though. There's much less downtime when you're free to explore without being chased. Once you get them off your tail, it'll be less than a few minutes before you hear them coming again. I found myself a little bit irritated with this in some chapters, especially since there's just not enough methods of escaping in some of them. The first 2 have plenty, but chapters 3 and 4 just didn't have very many at all. The game would have been an annoying nightmare if it wasn't for the fact that you can actually interact with everything in escape mode this time. In the first 3 games, if somebody was after you, you couldn't look at anything, you couldn't pick anything up, you could not interact with anything around you until Scissorman, or whoever was chasing you, was completely gone. The music faded away, and you were all alone. But here it doesn't really matter. Whether you're running or not, you're free to explore and solve puzzles to your heart's content, either way. And I feel really conflicted here because, like, on one hand, I feel like that kind of defeats the whole purpose of Clock Tower. It just belittles that sensation, makes the whole concept feel obsolete. Since there's no penalty for being chased, since you can do everything that you can do while not being chased, that those emotions aren't really there. That panic, that fear just doesn't really get instilled in you as much as it did in the previous games, but also because of that, it makes the game more playable and less annoying. Like, there's so many times in the first 3 games where I just wanted to do something, and then Scissorman or whoever it was would just show up, and then I had to run around for 5 to 10 minutes and then come back, and then I could do it. So I think it makes the game more playable, more accessible, more doable, and maybe more fun because of that, yet it makes the game less emotional, less panic-inducing, less scary, and like, this is a really uncomfortable point because there's no real definitive answer to it. It's extremely subjective. Like, a good example, I guess I could say, is like Resident Evil 4. That's a really fun game because of its action focus, and I would say it's way more fun than a game like Silent Hill, yet I've replayed Silent Hill way more times. It's resonated with me way more because of the emotions it instills in me, because of the panic and fear it makes me feel. So like, in the end, what's more important? There's no real answer to that. If I had to look at this in a positive light, I'd say it's simply a different take on it. The Pursuer is much more aggressive this time, so you'll spend more time running from them. So much to the point that you'll have to quickly do things while running, and I could see people being on either side of the fence as to whether or not they think this adds or detracts from the game. It's different, that much is certain. Health is completely gone in favor of the new panic system. If Alyssa takes damage or gets too close to a Pursuer, her panic meter will fill up, and if it gets maxed out, Alyssa will then enter a panic state where she'll frantically run away and becomes a little bit harder to control. If you take damage in this temporary state, it'll be game over. This new system's pretty interesting. It's a nice little deviation from the same old hit point system that they've used over and over, but I kind of really hate how she'll randomly stop to take a breath in panic mode. On more than one occasion, it's given me a pretty unfair game over, which had me a little bit annoyed. And some of the later chapters have it feel a tad too aggressively as well. Like, look, he was nowhere near me when he swung that weapon, yet the game was like, alright, let's just crank that right up. You can't just click continue without losing progress this time either. You'll lose everything you did after your last save, which I do like. There's finally a consequence for losing, so I actually felt inclined to perform better and, you know, not die. This does not apply to the boss fights though. If you die there, you'll just get to restart from the beginning of the fight, and yeah, boss fights in a clock tower game, right? Capcom definitely wanted to add some action in here. They're really strange, but I kinda like them. You'll use a magic bow and arrow against them, holding down triangle to charge up a shot. You can either win by draining their health all the way, or by getting them with enough fully charged shots in a row, which will bind them long enough for Alyssa to do an ultimate attack. And yeah, that's all there really is to it. You just run from them, dodge the attacks, and time your shots well. You can't freely aim the bow, she just aims it in the direction the boss is in, so you'll have to get the timing right to assure they'll still be in your line of sight when you fire that arrow. So if you guys want some context here, I should probably get you up to speed in this game's pretty ridiculous story. Essentially, Alyssa is a descendant of the Ruder bloodline. Basically, young girls under this lineage, after they turn 15, are granted the power to battle subordinates and entities. So a subordinate is basically some killer dude who died and then their spirit got reincarnated into a spooky monster man. There's 5 of them in the game total, and each chapter will feature one of them as the level's pursuer. We've got Sledgehammer, there's Corroder, Chopper. This guy was annoying as hell and I hated running from him. And the Scissor Twins, Scissor Man and Scissor Woman. No correlation with the Barrows family, they just have scissors, and yeah. These guys are a pair of clowns. It is kind of cool, this one area in Chapter 4 though, because there's this mirror you can use to access a flipped version of the hospital. Scissor Woman is on one side of the mirror and Scissor Man is on the other. I thought that was pretty neat. Okay, so those are subordinates. An entity is like this super powerful godlike form or something that can be achieved by sacrificing the human heart of somebody within the Ruder bloodline. So that's what this creepy old dude wants, is to sacrifice Alyssa's heart and become an entity, which is why Alyssa's mother told her to go into hiding until her 15th birthday was over. Now that she's roped into this ridiculous situation, Alyssa embraces her bloodline and uses her mystical powers to defeat the subordinates and rescue her mum, who got kidnapped. I completely forgot to mention that part. Definitely not what you'd expect from a clock tower game. It's much more heavy on the mythology and paranormal sides of things, and I guess the Resident Evil series kind of did a similar thing, getting really ridiculous, so maybe Capcom's to blame for this. But you know, I always felt the Barrows story was wrapped up nicely with the second game, so it's hard to feel betrayed with a story like this. The game is its own thing, even though it bears the Clock Tower name. But yeah, I really like this plot. It's super entertaining, and the melodramatic acting really enhanced that in my opinion. But running and hiding is all it really has to do with Clock Tower in the first place. The game plays way differently, and not just because it's no longer a point and click either. It's much more puzzle oriented. Puzzles that involve more than just, you know, find an item and use use it on the thing. I mean, there is still plenty of that, but we've also got stuff like safe puzzles and wire puzzles and stuff that actually has you reading a thing and maybe writing it down. There's one part where I had to interpret letters as numbers, and that was kind of neat. And thankfully, unlike Ghost Head, where the puzzles were impossibly cryptic and nonsensical, Clock Tower 3 does a really good job keeping the player on the right path without making it too blatantly obvious of what to do. There was even a part where I fell in the water from walking on the wrong plank, but little did I know I was doing exactly what the game wanted me to. This mistake triggered an optional ghost that I could exercise. Oh right, that's one thing about this game I really liked, the ghosts. Unlike the Subordinates, these things were genuinely creepy. The way they laugh at you especially, that's chilling. These are a secondary enemy to Alyssa that can't be attacked or hidden from, but they can't stray very far from their dead body, so they won't chase you throughout the entire level like the Subordinates will. You can defeat them by finding a certain memento the deceased person is emotionally bound to and returning it to their body, something like a lucky charm or a photograph of a loved one. It's both a cool game mechanic that rewards you with an expendable item, and it adds a little bit of flavor to the game's story as well. There's a lot of optional text that serves the same purpose, and I think they have a pretty good balance here. You'll still get the full story if you choose to skip out on it all, but taking the time to read it will certainly strengthen your bond to the game's world, and will make you more invested in the story overall. That's my favorite way of handling that sort of thing, using it to richen the game's world instead of trying to hide the whole story behind it. I was never really a big fan of games like Amnesia for doing something like that. This is more so what I'm in tune with personally. Oh, I almost forgot, there's consumable items you can use to restore your health or make yourself briefly invisible so you can get away. Didn't really find myself using them that much, but they're there and they can potentially be pretty helpful, especially when you're hiding and the Subordinate gets close enough to make Alyssa's panic start rising. If that thing gets full, Alyssa's gonna freak out and bust out of cover, so that's a pretty good thing to use when you're in a tight spot. But probably the biggest thing they added in this game was the holy water. You can use the triangle button to sprinkle this on Subordinates to slow their pursuit, or you can use it to lift magical seals, granting you access to certain rooms and whatnot. You can only hold a handful of these, but you can refill them as much as you'd like with stationary urns and fountains, which are usually found near save spots. And man, that motion to it just feels really good. Like, there's this delay to it after you hit the button. Kind of like the whip in Castlevania, I guess. I know that's kind of a weird comparison. Maybe not really, because that's like a whipping motion she's doing. She's not sprinkling it or pouring it. She's whipping it at the enemies, right? It's such a simple little thing, that delay, but man, it makes it so satisfying to pull off. So, unlike Clock Tower Ghost Head, the final level of this game actually takes place in a clock tower. Well, it's more like a big castle, but there's a clock tower in it. The first half of the game has you warping back and forth between the level and your house, and there's one nice little puzzle where you have to go back to the house to get something to use in the level, and it's kind of like an out-of-the-box puzzle where it's like, oh man, I need film for this camera. Where'd I see film before? In the desk in my house. You gotta go back and get it. It really reminds me of Silent Hill 4 and to an extent Eternal Darkness as well, and I really like it when games do that, but they only do it once in the whole game. I think it would have been really neat if they did it a little bit more than that. But yeah, every level is like this set piece in time that Alyssa is magically transported to, and it usually follows a subplot of a side character that was murdered by the level's Subordinate, and Alyssa's got to find a way to make peace with them so they can move on to the afterlife or whatever, and there's actually some like genuinely endearing and cute moments with this.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Halfway through the game, we get this pivotal story moment where your house explodes and the clock tower rises from the ashes and Alyssa's twirling around on the clock, and what is happening? I mean, visually, this is a fantastic scene. The CG here is out freaking standing. Again, we got that Capcom budget coming through, but like this is just a roller coaster of ridiculousness. And the second half is where we start marching into spoiler territory, so I'll throw up a timestamp if you want to skip them. I thought this story wasn't half bad. It's at least really entertaining, so it's worth experiencing on your own. So yeah, if you don't want to see that, you can, yeah, okay, y'all good? Okay, so it turns out that this old man is Alyssa's grandfather, Dick Hamilton, and he was obsessed with the Reuter bloodline and would constantly object to Alyssa's mother not wanting Alyssa to be a Reuter for her own safety. Dick blamed Alyssa's father for hammering that idea into her head and even murdered him in a fit of rage over it.
Why did Nancy have to marry a man like you? A man with no spine, no spirit?
Initially, the story paints Dick as this loving grandfather who's very wise and knows all about the goods and evils of the world, and he loves Alyssa very much and wants the very best for her. So, obviously, it becomes pretty apparent that Dick wants Alyssa to fulfill her destiny as a rooter and become this kick-ass teenage girl who'll dispel ghosts and demons and stuff, because, you know, that'd be pretty dope. Yo, what up? My granddaughter just killed a bunch of ghosts and demons and goblins and stuff, because I'm a pretty rad grandpa with a pretty rad granddaughter. I don't know. But it turns out Dick's plans were much grander than that. In the final stretch of the game, we find his office, and we see all of these drawings Alyssa did for him, and while that should convey a grandfatherly love, you know, keeping mementos that your granddaughter made for you, it instead comes off as really obsessive and weird. You look at this wall, it's like this looks like a cult. This is strange. Why do you have all of these? You ever watch 1 Hour Photo? Because it's exactly like that, except just like replace the photographs with drawings your granddaughter did for you, and it's just really strange. Dick became obsessed with the Barrows family, and I don't know if it's that Barrows family. It's spelled Burrows this time, and I think that might be a different interpretation of the same Japanese spelling, but there's always been a big debate around that because there's never been any official confirmation on whether or not this is the same family from the first 2 games. But anyway, Dick learned about the ritual to sacrifice the heart of a rooter to become an entity, so he made sure that Alyssa did become a rooter so he could then sacrifice her and achieve immortality. But then Alyssa's like, that's stupid, and then she transforms into this super duper Greek archer girl and slays her grandfather with a bow and arrow and rescues her mom and reunites with her childhood friend, and then she returns to living her normal happy life. This went like turbo ridiculous extremely quickly. Like, can you imagine if... What is that? Oh no. Scissor Man. No! I will not let you bring ruin to the Rooter bloodline! This is it. Say goodbye, Scissor Man. Oh, he's okay. Goodbye, I guess. I didn't think he would just like... I'm gonna... But, yeah, anyway, the lore here is definitely in tune with the series. I would say that. It's just the execution is just way over the top, and I can't understand why that would turn some people off. The tone here is just really foreign to what the series spent 3 entire games establishing, right? But even still, I had a pretty great time with Clock Tower 3. The gameplay's a little bit on the basic side. It's kind of like a watered-down version of Silent Hill, you know, without the enemies or weapons, and they have the Clock Tower-style pursuits in its place, but it doesn't have that atmosphere the series is known for, and I think it kind of fails as a horror game in that regard. But there's definitely enough here that's unique and interesting enough to make it a fun game even still, and the plot is cool, wacky, and entertaining. You might not love it as a Clock Tower game, but I really enjoyed it as its own bizarre and melodramatic interpretation of the series. It's kind of like a big Hollywood movie. You got the big budget, the fun, the explosiveness, but you know, there's going to be elements of the series that get lost in the process. A lot of people often ask me what's a good entry point if you want to get into the horror genre, and I never really had a definitive answer to that, but now I think I would say start with Clock Tower 3, you know, like it has all of those nuances and hits all of those beats that I love horror games for, except it's executed in a much more timid and accessible way. It's not a very difficult game, and it's not really very scary at all, at least I can't imagine it would be to most people, but it's a really fun game, and I think it's a good way of introducing you to a lot of these things that you would come to expect from more horror games down the line. So yeah, that is Clock Tower 3. Really did not meet my expectations whatsoever, but I still had a blast with it. This would be the last Clock Tower game that ever got made. This is the last one they ever put out, though there is some speculation as to whether or not Haunting Ground was a spiritual sequel in a sense, and then there's also that spiritual successor that was kickstarted by the original game's director, Nightcry. Maybe I'll take a look at those two next year, but for now, this is going to mark the end of the current Halloween marathon. So yeah, thanks everybody for watching. A big shout out to everybody that watched my little trek through the Clock Tower series. Even bigger shout out to all the people that commented on the September Halloween marathon episodes with like, you know it's September, right? You know it's not Halloween yet, right? Yes, I know. YouTube loves engagement, and when I get a lot of comments, it recommends my videos a lot more. So when I got 2,000 comments that all said the same thing, all YouTube was concerned about was how many there were. So y'all got played like a damn fiddle, bitch. But yeah, that aside, I guess thank you for watching. Have yourselves a fantastic night, and more importantly, have a happy and safe Halloween. And I'll see you guys next time with